Nobody tells you the moment it happens. There's no alarm, no warning label. No one stands over you and says, "This is the day you stopped asking questions." It just happens quietly. You're handed a belief. You're told it's sacred. And slowly, without even noticing, the part of you that used to wonder goes silent. This video is not an attack on faith. It's something more dangerous than that. It's a question. What happens to a mind that learns to trust before it learns to think? What does that cost you? And who benefits from the price you pay? Because here's what no one tells you. Faith, when used correctly, can be a compass. But when it replaces thinking entirely, it becomes a cage with no visible walls. And the worst part? You'll defend those walls like they're keeping you safe. The architecture of belief. Think about the last thing you were absolutely certain about. Not hoped, not assumed, certain. Now ask yourself a simple question. Where did that certainty come from? Most of what we call knowledge wasn't discovered by us. It was installed. By parents, by culture, by repetition, by the slow accumulation of things we heard so many times we stopped noticing we were hearing them. We absorbed our worldview the way children absorb language, not through analysis, but through immersion. Psychologists call this enculturation. It is the process by which a society transfers its values, its norms, and its deepest assumptions into a child's mind before that child has developed the cognitive tools to evaluate any of them. It doesn't feel like programming. It feels like love. A parent teaches a child what is true, what is right, what is real, and the child believes them, because trusting the parent is survival. That's not a flaw in children. That's the genius of it. But here's where things get complicated. That same mechanism, the one designed to protect a helpless and dependent child, can be exploited. Not always maliciously. Sometimes it happens through the purest of intentions, through the sincere desire to give a child a map before they're old enough to be lost. But the effect is the same regardless of the intention behind it. You inherit a worldview before you have a self to own it. You receive answers before you've learned to ask the questions those answers are supposed to address. And then you grow up, and the world starts asking things of you that your inherited map never accounted for, and something in you tightens. Most people respond to that tightness by defending the map, by insisting the map is correct and the territory is wrong. Because the alternative, admitting the map might be incomplete, feels too much like losing the ground beneath your feet. And most people never go back to audit the foundations, because the foundations were laid in the dark, before they were watching, before they even knew to look. But here's the question worth sitting with. If you never chose what you believe, do you really believe it? Or are you just maintaining something you were given? When don't question is the first commandment. Every belief system has its sacred zones. The areas where inquiry is unwelcome, where questions are treated not as curiosity but as transgression. You've probably encountered them. You ask something honest, and the response isn't an answer. It's a warning. That's dangerous thinking. The enemy plants doubts in your mind. Some things aren't meant to be questioned, just trust. On the surface, this sounds like guidance. It can even sound like protection. Like someone who cares about you is steering you away from a cliff. But think carefully about what's actually being communicated. Your doubt is a threat. Your curiosity is a weapon pointed at yourself. The safest thing you can possibly do is to stop asking. That is not spiritual guidance. That is a control mechanism. And it doesn't matter what flag it flies under, whether it's religious, political, ideological, or cultural. Any system that responds to sincere questions with shame or punishment is not protecting you. It is protecting itself. This has always been true. The history of human thought is littered with the names of people who asked honest questions and paid brutal prices for it. Galileo placing the sun at the center. Spinoza questioning the divine authorship of Scripture. Darwin describing the origin of species. Women who asked why they couldn't lead. Young people who asked why they had to believe something they couldn't feel. All of them were told, in one way or another, that the question itself was the problem. What does that pattern tell us? It tells us the question was dangerous to someone. It tells us that someone had something to lose if the question was honestly pursued and honestly answered. And here is the part worth pausing on. That someone was almost never the person asking. The people who get silenced for asking are rarely the ones who benefit from the silence. The ones who benefit are the ones enforcing it. So, the next time you feel that subtle pressure, that cultural weight that says certain questions are off the table, ask yourself one more question: who told you that? And what do they have to lose if you keep going? The comfort trap. Here's something worth admitting out loud, because this channel doesn't work if we're not honest. Certainty feels incredible. When you know who you are, why you're here, what happens when you die, what your life is meant to accomplish, there is a peace in that. A stillness that the rest of the world, with its noise and its contradictions and its terrifying open-endedness, simply cannot offer. And the world without that certainty is genuinely frightening. Psychologists have a term for it: intolerance of ambiguity. Some people are neurologically and emotionally wired to experience deep, destabilizing distress in the face of uncertainty. For those people, an absolute belief system is not just comforting. It functions like oxygen. To take it away feels like suffocation. That experience is real. It deserves to be acknowledged and met with compassion, not contempt. But here's the cost, and this is the part that rarely gets spoken plainly. When certainty becomes more important than truth, when being right matters more than being accurate, the mind begins to change in ways its owner cannot see. It stops processing incoming information as information. It starts sorting everything into two piles: things that confirm what I already know and things that threaten what I already know. The first pile gets accepted. The second gets dismissed, distorted, or demonized. Psychologists call this confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, but those clinical terms don't quite capture how deep the effect runs. Research shows that when people are presented with evidence that contradicts a deeply held belief, the areas of the brain associated with threat response actually activate. It feels like danger. It feels like an attack. And the natural response to an attack is defense, not reflection. Here is the line that should stay with you long after this video ends. We do not reason our way to conclusions. We conclude first, then reason our way back. Most of us, most of the time, are not thinking. We are defending. We are building legal arguments in favor of a verdict that was handed to us before we ever walked into the courtroom. And the tragedy is not that people do this. The tragedy is that they believe, sincerely and completely, that they are simply following the truth wherever it leads. The borrowed self. Here is a question that sounds simple but tends to stay with you. Who would you be if you had been born somewhere else? Different country, different century, different family, different God on the wall above the kitchen table? Would you still hold the same beliefs? Would the truths you hold most deeply still feel true? The honest answer, for almost all of us, is no, and that should give us real pause. Because if our deepest convictions are largely determined by where we happen to land when we entered the world, are they really ours? Are they conclusions we reached, or coordinates we were given? There is a term in developmental psychology called identity foreclosure. It describes what happens when a person adopts a complete identity, often handed down by parents or community, without ever going through the uncomfortable, searching process of questioning whether it fits. From the outside, these people look settled, confident, even admirable in their certainty. But underneath that confidence, there is often a quiet fragility that reveals itself the moment anyone asks a genuinely probing question. Because a self that was never truly chosen is a self that cannot be truly defended. Any challenge to the belief becomes something bigger and scarier than an intellectual disagreement. It becomes a threat to the person's entire sense of who they are. This is why conversations about faith can turn so quickly from philosophical to personal, from calm to wounded. It's not that the argument being made is logically overwhelming. It's that it touches something deeper than logic. It touches the question of whether the person exists at all outside the belief that was handed to them. Think about someone you know who responds to honest questions about their faith, not with curiosity, but with something that looks like fear or anger. That reaction is not evidence of certainty. It is evidence of the opposite. Real security in a belief can hold a challenge the same way a solid tree holds wind. It bends a little, and then it stands. What you're watching when someone shuts down or retreats is not strength. It is the recognition, somewhere below the surface, that the roots might not go as deep as they were told. The God-shaped hammer. There is an old observation about problem solving. Give a child a hammer, and suddenly everything looks like a nail. When we have only one tool, we use it on everything. And when that tool is a religious or ideological framework that claims to explain all of reality, the results can be genuinely devastating. When faith becomes the only cognitive tool a person has, the only lens through which they interpret what happens in the world, it stops functioning as a spiritual resource. It becomes a verdict machine. Someone dies young and the answer is ready before the grief has settled. God's plan. A prayer goes unanswered and the explanation arrives immediately. Not enough faith. A disaster strikes a community, and the theological accounting begins before the rubble is cleared. Notice what is actually happening in each of those cases. No evidence can challenge the framework, because the framework is designed to absorb all evidence as confirmation. Good things happen. God is blessing you. Bad things happen. God is testing you. The system cannot be proven wrong, because it has already decided that everything is proof it is right. Philosophers have a word for this: unfalsifiability. A claim that can absorb any outcome as confirmation is not a truth claim at all. It is a closed loop dressed in the language of insight. And the danger does not stay abstract. When suffering is always assigned cosmic meaning before its actual causes are examined, those causes go uninvestigated and unchanged. When tragedy is immediately filed under God's will, accountability quietly disappears. Children have died because parents responded to medical emergencies with prayer instead of treatment. Communities have remained in cycles of poverty because suffering was reframed as spiritual virtue rather than systemic injustice. People who caused real harm avoided real consequences because their victims were taught that forgiveness was holier than justice. None of this is the inevitable result of having faith. It is what happens when faith is allowed to occupy spaces it was never designed to fill, and when a culture forms around the idea that questioning that occupation is the most dangerous thing a person can do. The social cost of certainty. Here is something that almost never gets said with enough directness. Unquestioned belief does not stay contained within the person who holds it. It radiates. It moves outward through families, communities, institutions, and entire societies. The cost of absolute certainty is never paid only by the person who is certain. When someone is absolutely convinced that they are right, and absolutely convinced that their rightness comes from a source beyond question or accountability, a very specific logic begins to operate. People who disagree are not simply mistaken, they are a problem. Depending on the belief system, they might be lost souls in need of saving, dangerous influences who must be kept away from children, enemies of a divine order, or simply less than fully human. History does not leave this dynamic in any ambiguity. We know what happens when entire communities or nations organize themselves around absolute certainty about what God wants and who God favors. The large-scale expressions of it are well documented. But the subtler, quieter versions are happening right now, in living rooms and church offices and school board meetings and legislatures around the world. A parent who cannot love their child through a change of belief. A congregation that freezes out a member who asks too many questions. A law imposed on an entire population because one tradition is certain it knows what is morally correct. The mechanism in all of these cases is the same. Absolute certainty makes empathy structurally difficult. Real empathy, the kind that actually reaches another person and takes their experience seriously, requires a willingness to hold your own perspective loosely enough to let someone else's in. It requires the ability to say, genuinely, maybe I don't have the full picture. Maybe their experience of reality is as real and valid as mine. Maybe I have something to learn here. Absolute certainty forecloses exactly that. It doesn't just make you less likely to change your mind. It makes you less able to genuinely see the person in front of you. And a world built by people who cannot truly see each other is not a world that gets better. It is a world that keeps dividing itself along the fault lines of whose certainty gets to win. The children in the room. If there is one place in this entire conversation where the stakes become undeniable, where the abstract becomes urgent, it is here. It is with children. Because every pattern we have traced in this video, inherited belief, foreclosed identity, confirmation bias, the silencing of honest questions. All of it begins in the earliest years of a human life, before the person has any capacity to consent to what they are being given. Before a child can critically evaluate a claim, before they have the cognitive architecture to assess evidence or weigh competing explanations, they are being told what is absolutely, eternally, cosmically true. About the nature of existence, about who deserves what, about which questions are allowed and which are dangerous. And they believe it. Of course they believe it. They believe it because they believe the people telling them. They believe those people because love and trust are the same thing when you are small. Here is the question that deserves to be asked plainly. Is there a meaningful difference between teaching a child your values and teaching them your certainties? Values are orientations. Be kind, be honest, look out for people who are struggling. Certainties are conclusions. This specific account of creation is literally true. This group of people is right and that group is wrong. Doubt is the enemy. One gives a child tools to navigate the world. The other gives them a map and tells them the map is the world. Millions of adults are walking around right now carrying beliefs they absorbed before the age of 6, beliefs they have never examined, never chosen, never tested against their own honest experience of what is real. And they feel the weight of those beliefs every time someone challenges them. Not just intellectual discomfort, something deeper. A tightness in the chest, a flash of threat. A low, persistent anxiety that lives just underneath the surface of their daily life. That anxiety has a source. It often traces back to a room, and a voice, and a child who was learning what was true about the world before they knew they were being taught. And the adults who taught them almost always believed, completely and without question, that they were doing an act of love. The way forward. Let's be clear about what this video is not. It is not an argument that meaning is impossible, or that belief is always a weakness, or that people who hold deep convictions are somehow lesser thinkers than those who don't. That framing would be just as closed and lazy as the thinking we've been examining. This is something more nuanced, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Examined faith is more powerful than inherited certainty. Not weaker, more powerful. A belief you have genuinely wrestled with, one that has survived your doubts and your honest, darkest moments of not knowing. That belief belongs to you in a way that no conviction handed to you in childhood ever can. You own it, you chose it, and because you chose it through real inquiry, you can hold it with both firmness and humility at the same time. The goal of this video was never to empty your hands. It was to ask whether what you're holding is actually yours. There is a profound difference between a person who believes something because they examined it and found it true, and a person who believes something because they were taught that questioning it was a form of disloyalty or spiritual failure. One of those people is free. The other is occupied by a belief that doesn't quite belong to them. So here is the practical invitation. Read the book they told you not to read. Have the conversation they warned would lead you astray. Ask the question in the direction that produces that specific tightness in your chest, the one that shows up when you're getting close to something that matters. Not to destroy what you believe. Not to prove your community wrong, but to find out whether what you hold can survive honest scrutiny. Because if it can't survive a sincere question, it was never a truth. It was a coping mechanism. And you deserve something more durable than that. Real truth does not need to be protected from inquiry. It does not need enforcers or warning labels or forbidden questions. Real truth is what remains when you take all of that away. And the only way to find out what remains is to actually look. What healthy faith actually looks like. Not all faith is the same. This is important enough to say twice. The conversation we've been having is not a description of all religious belief or all spiritual conviction. It is a description of a specific kind, the kind that cannot be questioned, the kind that requires enforcement, the kind that treats doubt as a threat and curiosity as betrayal. And it is worth being clear, that version of faith is not the only version. There is a profound distinction between faith as a foundation and faith as a fortress. Faith as a foundation looks like this. I hold certain things as deeply meaningful. I don't have certainty about all of it, and I'm not sure certainty is the point. I've wrestled with the hard questions, and I'm still wrestling. I'm open to learning more, to being surprised, to discovering I had parts of this wrong. That kind of faith produces people who are genuinely curious, genuinely humble, and genuinely kind, in a way that doesn't require you to agree with them in order to receive it. Faith as a fortress looks entirely different. It says, "I have the truth. It was given to me by an authority that cannot be questioned, and anything that challenges it is by definition false or dangerous." That kind of faith produces people who are rigid in proportion to how threatened they feel, and the threats seem to multiply as the world continues to refuse to confirm the map they were handed. The most grounded and spiritually alive people I have ever encountered share a particular quality. They can hold their beliefs with seriousness and with lightness at the same time. They can say, "I might be wrong about some of this," without feeling the ground dissolve beneath them. They meet your doubt not with defensiveness, but with genuine curiosity about where your question is coming from. They experience uncertainty not as an enemy, but as an invitation to go deeper. That is not weakness. That is the most rare and demanding form of intellectual and spiritual strength there is. And it is available to anyone willing to hold their convictions firmly in one hand and their humility firmly in the other, and refuse to let go of either. So, here is where we land. Faith is not the enemy. Certainty wielded as a weapon is. Thinking switched off in the name of devotion is. A generation of children handed answers before they've been given the freedom to ask their own questions. That is where the damage begins. The quiet damage isn't always a scandal. It isn't always something you can point to in a headline. Sometimes, it's just a person in their 30s who has never learned to trust their own mind. Someone who feels a low hum of panic whenever a question gets too close to something sacred. Someone who walked away from the people they love most because their community presented belief and belonging as a package deal, and leaving one meant losing the other. That's the cost. And no one names it, because the system that created it has spent decades teaching the people inside it that the discomfort they feel is their own fault. That the doubt is the problem, not the conditions that made doubt feel like danger. But here is what I want you to take from this. A mind that questions is not a mind that has lost its way. It is a mind that is finding one. The willingness to sit with a hard question, to resist the easy comfort of a pre-packaged answer, to follow your own honest thinking wherever it leads, that is not a failure of faith. That is its highest expression. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Unexamined certainty is. And real wisdom, the kind that has been earned through genuine struggle and honest looking, always leaves room for more light. It never seals the windows. It never locks the doors. So, keep asking, keep reading, keep following the questions that produce that familiar tightness, the ones that you were taught to walk past quickly and not examine, not because you are lost, but because you are finally, seriously, looking. And if this video made you think differently about something you were never supposed to question, subscribe. Because that is exactly what this channel exists to do.